So the last video that I made was called Judging the Heart of a Liberal, and it is essentially my critique of what I see as the biggest fault on the political left. And to sum it up, it's basically their conceit. My observation of many on the left is they often have way too much confidence in both the wisdom of their policy prescriptions as well as the compassion in their hearts, and they tend to look down on other people, people with different policy prescriptions, and they think within themselves that they're the caring people, and those other people with the different policy ideas are less compassionate. It couldn't be that they just have a different understanding of the problem and a policy that reflects that. It's got to be like they just don't care about the issue. So I won't rehash all that. I'll link that video below. It's my last upload if anybody's interested in watching that full video. But what I do want to do in this video is respond to some of the comments. I've been having a back and forth in my comments section with skeptics and atheists over the topic of Christian values, their relevance, and their effect on society. So in this video, I'm going to read through some of those comments and expound upon them a little bit, and try to answer questions like just how much effect does Christian belief and Christian values have on society, particularly Western countries where it's been more of a stronghold. I mean, clearly it's had some effect, particularly in Europe that's been predominantly Christian for over a millennia. And of course, the United States was settled largely by, at least its European settlers were largely Christian in one form or another. And not only that, I suppose, but like as Europeans began to explore the world during the 16th and 17th century, they took those beliefs and proselytized them elsewhere. There's missionaries as they were exploring the New World and rounding the Horn of Africa to make their way to India. I mean, a lot of missionaries took that route as well. So what effect did the teachings of Christ have in these societies? That's what I want to speculate about in this video. So the commenter I'm going to respond to here is Jordan Carter, and he's going to question or critique my assertion that Christian values lead to better outcomes, essentially. Like an individual that adopts them will live a happier, more fulfilled life and will probably prosper more than somebody that rejects Christian values or behaves contrary to them. That's my general premise. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of detail in that assertion that you would have to unpack to truly analyze it. Like, for example, what exactly are Christian values? How do we judge who's actually following them? What criteria are we measuring, happiness and fulfillment by? So there's all sorts of rabbit holes you could go down trying to frame that assertion. And I guess there's probably enough wiggle room and there's enough disparity in data that if you really wanted to, I mean, you could just pick the data in such a way as to come up to whatever conclusion you want on the matter. There's enough confounding variables, and that's reflected in the data that really, like, you can make whatever case you want, depending on which study you're gonna look at and how you're going to interpret religiosity or Christian values. There's this lovely quote attributed to Caesar that men in general are quick to believe what they wish to be true. And I'm certainly not suggesting that the commenter is doing this, but I'm just pointing out that it's a pattern of men. I, as a Christian, my tendency is going to be to look for the data that supports my case, and I'm gonna look at that data at the sort of the resolution level where the view that I want to see comes into focus. It's going to be my tendency, and the reverse is true. The same is true of the skeptic. his natural tendency, more than likely, is going to be to look for the data that supports his conclusion. And if zooming in on the problem and looking at it real close, like looking for the devil in the details, if that doesn't support his case, well, then he's going to ignore that resolution level, and he's going to step way back, and he's going to look at the data from far away, where he can still make the case that Christian values aren't a positive influence on society. And I want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that I'm doing that, or that that my commenter here is doing that. I'm just saying, like, that's human nature, and that's our tendency. And the best way to mitigate that is just to be humble, admit that you have an opinion, but it could be wrong, and then have conversations with people that have a different opinion. And I guess building on the theme of my last video, my theme of my last video is basically that liberals are blind a lot of times because they're conceited, and they don't have what I just talked about. They don't humble themselves and like test their opinion by discussing it with people that don't agree with them. In fact, they often shun such people. It used to be that shunning was sort of a religious practice. Like if one of your brothers of the faith was just radically off the plot in some way, his community might shun him in hopes to sort of shame him into back into the fold. But you don't necessarily have to be religious to do this, because a lot of people do it. A lot of political partisans will do this. Like friendships in the U.S. are broken up over political disputes. Even families, even familial bonds are broken because I don't want to talk to this sibling of mine because hey, they voted for the wrong guy. Anyway, where am I going with this? I guess to bring it back in, men are prone to quickly find the data and evidence that supports the view that they already believe, and they're very slow to accept data that tells a different story. They're quick to find fault with that data. And same thing's true with experts. I mean, you can find almost any issue, you can find experts on either side of it. So the question is, well, which group of experts do you agree with? There's a good chance that you'll find some reason to agree with the experts that share your views and argue for your views. And there's a good chance that you'll find a way to dismiss the experts that have a contrary view. Those experts are actually just quacks and not real experts. But the experts that support my opinion, those are the ones that you should listen to. And again, this is in no way a commentary on Jordan Carter, the commenter that I'm responding to, because he seems very reasonable and is willing to have a conversation. But in general, this is how I observe people. So anyway, this is what we're up against. People that are skeptical of Christianity their tendency is to not see the value in it. If you're a Christian and you're trying to defend your worldview, well, then your tendency is to see the value in it. And in either case, it's gonna color how you look for evidence. So we're talking about crime rate and values, and I guess I'll just read through some of this and respond to it. The thing I will agree with you on is that crime is a multifaceted issue. It's a point that I bring up in the previous video. Dumping money on an issue doesn't solve it, and how kids are raised, etc., does have a massive part to play. So essentially, in this video, I was talking about like values and how they basically make or break a neighborhood. For example, communities that have really strong family structures where there's more two-parent households, where both father and mother are good, competent parents, they're good role models. The more a community has households like that, the less crime's going to be there. The kids are going to be more well-adjusted and less likely to get into crime, and the community's just going to be better because of it. And the reverse is true. Communities with broken homes, incompetent parenting, father might not be in the picture, mother might have all kinds of problems herself, mother might also not be the best role model. And like if that describes 90% of the households in your community, then yeah, that community is going to have a lot of problems. And young men reach adulthood and get their natural boost of testosterone if they have no guidance as how how to channel that energy and that drive, well, it's going to get real ugly real fast. So I digress, but basically that's a major theme that I hit in my last video. So he goes on. However, for us in other countries where they have less crime but are less religious or less Christian, it just doesn't seem to hold true that just following the example of Christ is the thing that allows people to be more upstanding citizens. So, I mean, that's the basic critique. Does having Christian values, is it a net positive, or is it a neutral? Is it a negative? Can we get by perfectly fine without Christian values? On one hand, I think the answer is kind of obvious. I think it's pretty obvious that the values that a society holds, the values that an individual in society holds, and their beliefs, and not just what they say they believe, but what they actually believe when they're thinking through things and analyzing the world around them and plotting their course, how they're going to navigate things. Like, clearly, like, whatever they truly value and believe is going to inform how they do that. And it doesn't matter, what set of beliefs you're talking about. I think this would logically be a pretty easy case to accept that your values and beliefs truly do inform your behavior. I mean, consider how women are generally treated in Muslim majority countries. They're often treated in such a way and fill such a role in society because that's what the majority of the people, the majority of the people follow the teachings of Islam and really seem to believe that, so the beliefs of Islam largely inform how they treat women in society. And you could say the same thing with religious skeptics. I mean, look at how skeptics are treated in Western, historically Christian countries versus how they're treated in Muslim majority countries. Richard Dawkins can come out and mock Christian belief. He can mock people that believe in Christendom, and he can live fairly well, just as well as anybody else. He enjoys notoriety. He enjoys being able to publicly speak and share his views. He writes books on the subject and can publish them and sell them and make money off of his critiques of religion. And he can do all of that in a Christian majority country. They don't throw him in jail. They're not burning him on a stake. And that's not to say that there wasn't dark episodes in the history of the West where people seen as heretics were burned at the stake. I'm just saying that throughout many centuries, including our own, Christianity seems perfectly compatible with liberal democracies. Like, my religion allows me to be tolerant of people that don't agree with me. It allows me to be tolerant of people that are even violating the principles of my faith. For example, you could live in my community and you could be, let's say you're an atheist, and let's say you practice what would be considered sexual immorality in my religious tradition. Nothing criminal per se, but just stuff that is outside the biblical concept of marriage. You just do whatever you want in that regard. Assuming it's perfectly legal and involving consenting adults and all the like. Well, in Christendom, you can still be my neighbor, and I don't have to, concern myself with your unbelief and your godless lifestyle. As long as you're not trying to do it to me, what business is it of mine? So you can still be my neighbor. Now, you wouldn't be qualified to be the pastor of my church, or for that matter, an elder or a deacon. Like, obviously, like, if you don't believe and you don't follow the values, you would be disqualified from serving in a leadership role in a Bible believing church that has any standards whatsoever. Beyond that, I mean, it'd be perfectly fine, like, if you were my neighbor. And I suppose I wouldn't treat you any different than I would treat anybody else. Your beliefs are your beliefs, and your lifestyle is your lifestyle as long as it's not directly harming me or anybody else. What business is it of mine? As for your unbelief, well, truly, it's only God that can open the eyes of an unbeliever anyway. And I suspect God tends to prod everybody in his way, and depending on how you respond to that, maybe he'll prod you a little bit more. Ultimately, it's God that opens the eyes of the believer. So, for my part, other than just witness to you, what can I do if you don't believe what I believe? I understand that Christian societies or societies purporting to be Christian haven't always been so tolerant. And, I understand that there was things like the Spanish Inquisition, but in my opinion, those people weren't following the New Testament because there's no basis for that in Scripture. There's no basis for torturing people until they break down and make some under duress. They make some profession of faith. What is that worth? I mean, clearly, like if you have to torture somebody to get them to profess a faith, they probably don't truly believe it anyway. So what's the point? In my opinion, any Christian society that engaged in things like the Spanish Inquisition were grossly in error in how they followed the faith. And likewise, like in the times of the early church, there was people that were in the church. And the church wasn't necessarily a building. It was just the community of believers in a city would be considered the church of, Laodicea or whatever the city it happened to be was. But in the church context, yeah, if you're a member of the church, you should follow the moral teachings of the New Testament. You should be a sexually moral person. You shouldn't worship idols and Christ at the same time. So I would judge a brother in the church by a different standard than I would judge an unbeliever outside of the church. Sometimes I think Christians get overly fixated on what the unrepentant world does. And yeah, it's our job to go out and witness to them. It's our job to say, hey, God's going to judge this behavior, and beyond that point, you need forgiveness for your transgressions, and here's this way that you can follow to get right with God. And that's basically the job description of a good Christian. It's to follow the example, walk the walk, so that you can be a witness to others, and they can say, well, that guy must be doing something right. Why is he so happy and well-adjusted? And in doing so, you'll be a witness to them, and some of them might come to believe because of the example that they saw in you. But it's not my place to judge them. Ultimately, if you reject all God's attempts to right your ship in life, you just harden your heart against that, and you just belligerently live according to your own will. Me beating you up over that isn't probably going to help anything. I think maybe I'm bouncing around a little bit, but I just felt like expounding on that. But anyway, like, how do we objectively measure whether or not Christianity is a positive force in society? And that's where things get murky, because there's a whole lot of ways to collect data. There's a whole lot of ways to quantify and compare data. And that's what I sort of get into. I also go on this rant about cultural Christians. People that are skeptics or unbelievers, but they like living in Christian societies generally because they're a lot nicer than other types of societies that have other beliefs. But there are skeptics that also aren't cultural Christians. They think the world is worse because of Christianity, and to them, I think many of them are fish in water. So I write back, sure, recent generations have gotten less religious by some metrics, but that doesn't mean the Western world hasn't been Christian for centuries. It's possible to absorb values and principles that benefit you and your community without believing in the ultimate source of those principles. So I go on to talk about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. The same sort of respect and courtesy that you would want others to show you, you should show that to other people. Now, I believe that's like a divine command, essentially. This is how Christ taught us to live. So, if for no other reason, that's one more reason for me to try to live this way. Now, you don't have to believe that God exists, and you don't have to believe that He's going to judge you if you don't follow this teaching. To follow it, I mean, there's a lot of other reasons that an atheist could come up with to follow the golden rule. For one reason, like, people are generally reciprocal. Like, if you treat them a certain way and show them respect, well, they'll naturally do it back for you. Usually, not always. Sometimes you show people respect and they turn around and treat you terribly. But generally, people are receptive to that. And because some people are, it's a good enough reason just to follow this golden rule for no other reason. Is because it gets you good results. People are likely to treat you in kind. Now, is that as powerful of a reason than you believe in God and you think God will judge you if you don't follow the golden rule, or at least try to follow it? I would argue that the judgment of all-knowing God is a pretty compelling reason to follow the golden rule. But I do concede the point that, perhaps through the examples of others, or perhaps through personal reflection, you meditate on your thoughts and you come to the conclusion, yeah, it would be better for me to live this way. You could come to follow the golden rule without believing in the source. So yes, it is possible for non-believers and skeptics to behave like decent people. So I'm trying to say the same thing in different ways, but yeah, you can be the beneficiary of Christian values and culture without being a believer. It is possible to coast on momentum for a while. And from experience, I believe it is good to follow the principles, but it's better to follow the principles and be plugged into the source, to have this relationship with God, which is what the New Testament offers people. Because yes, I can, of my own will, try to follow the Christian teachings, just like I can try to follow the Mosaic Law, the Ten Commandments and things like that. But I'm going to fall short, right? So what picks up the slack? First of all, even the best of us fall short. Like, even the righteous people in the Old Testament have had a dark side. King David was handpicked by God. The scriptures say that God judged him as a man after his own heart. So think of that. Like, he's saying, like, this man's heart is very similar to mine. He sees things the way I see them. By many metrics, you could argue that King David was a good king in the Old Testament. But he also had his dark moments. He had his sins. He fell short of God's standards. I'm not going to go into all the details, but that those commandments: thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not do murder. They're pretty serious offenses, right? So even the best of us need the grace of God. We need to be forgiven. We need to be perfected in our walk, to truly follow the teachings in the New Testament. You need a lot of help from God. You need to be plugged into the source, as I put it. Now, this is a spiritual claim, and it takes spiritual eyes to truly understand what I'm saying and to relate to it. But that's not the way unbelievers see the world, right? They don't have those spiritual eyes. And that may sound like a cop-out to some, like, oh, well, isn't that convenient? You need the Spirit to truly grasp scriptures. But yeah, you kind of need the keys to unlock the door to get into the house. And the keys in the New Testament is faith. King David wasn't righteous because of his works. King David was judged righteous and a man after God's own heart because of his faith. both his relationship with God and his perspective on his relationship with God. And ultimately, it was his faith that put him in the good graces of God. So I'm not saying that you, as a non-believer, if that's what you happen to be, whoever the viewer happens to be, if you're a non-believer, there's still a lot of insights and wisdom you could get from just reading the Sermon on the Mount, reading the other teachings in the New Testament and following them. You could follow or try to follow a lot of them without believing that God even exists. You could just think, well, this was good teaching, so I'm going to follow it, and it will profit you. Like, it will benefit your life. I point out the golden rule, and I've already explained how people will reciprocate that, and enough of them will do it where it could be very advantageous for you to follow the golden rule and try to treat others the way you would want to be treated. This will win you a lot of friends, or at least win you the respect of other people. Will it save your soul?
Who will save your soul when it comes to the flowers now? Who will save your soul after those lies that you told, boy? And who will save your soul?
Probably not, because if you don't believe you have a soul that needs to be saved, it's hard to get you to walk out over that bridge. And there's many other teachings from the New Testament that even an atheist could practice, or at least make an attempt to practice, and it would benefit him. Take, for example, the Lord's Prayer. We have this part of the Lord's Prayer: "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." And at the end of it, Christ instructs people that for if you forgive men their trespasses, their sins, the wrongs against you, the things that people do to get on your nerves, if you forgive them that, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Now, as a Christian, I believe there is a God, and he'll judge me if I'm not a forgiving person towards others, he's not going to be a forgiving person towards me. So I have that compelling reason to try to follow this. But even if you don't believe that there is a heavenly Father, and that he's going to judge you for not forgiving other people, it's often good for you to let go of things that people have done to wrong you. Now, you don't need to be a Christian to do this, and I know a lot of Christians that don't do this, and they don't have the peace of God dwelling with them because they're just holding on to all these grudges. These are people that profess to be believers. They say they believe in God, they say they believe in Christ and the New Testament, but they don't follow this in their life, and it keeps them from the peace of God. Likewise, you could just be, a reflective atheist, as wise as an unbeliever can be, and a self-aware person, and you could realize that, it doesn't make sense for me to get all worked up about the old lady that doesn't know how to use the roundabout and cut me off in the circle the other day. Or I can just accept that other people aren't perfect. They make mistakes. I make mistakes. They made a mistake. It's done. There's no point in me dwelling on it, right? There's no point in me being pissed off for the next 15 minutes because someone made a mistake in a world that's outside of my control. Or maybe somebody said something to me that I didn't like the way they said it to me, and I took offense in it. I could let that bother me all day and stew on it. But what's the point? I can either just turn the other cheek, let it go, realize that not everybody's perfect. They're going to say dumb things from time to time. Or, another solution would be I could actually just have a conversation with that person and say, look, I understand what you were trying to say, but I wish you would have said it like so, because the way you said it was, disrespectful or something. Either just let it go, either just, in a healthy way try to talk to the person. Either one of those options would be better than just stewing on it and being pissed off for the next several hours because somebody said something you didn't like. Again, God's not giving us this instruction for his good. He's giving it to us for our good. He's trying to help us be better followers of him, because ultimately following him is the best thing for us. I'll give one more example. It goes along the same thought in the spirit of forgiveness. In Matthew 5, starting with verse 21, you have heard that it has been said of old. So in the Old Testament, it was, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be in danger of judgment. What is murder? It's killing somebody basically with no moral justification. It's not self-defense. There's not a legitimate reason why you took a life. That would be murder. But Christ goes on to teach people that I say, who is ever angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment. In the Ten Commandments, it was thou shalt not murder. But Christ is saying the reason this is there is so that you learn to be civil to your brethren, to your neighbors. And he's saying that if you're angry without a cause, you're in danger of God's judgment. And if you escalate things, so if you're angry and then you start to escalate things by speaking harshly to your brother, Reka, I think that translates something like vain fellow, you should be in danger of the council. But if you call your brother a fool, you should be in danger of hellfire. And again, this is, whether you're a believer or not, this is good advice. Don't be angry at people. Don't harbor grudges without a good cause. Don't escalate things by speaking harshly to people. You don't need to be a believer to see the wisdom in that. Why are you trying to start a fight, basically? And he ends by, telling people to reconcile with your brother if you're angry at him. If you bring a gift to the altar, in the Old Testament, they would sacrifice things to God on an altar. He's saying, before you do that, before you bother trying to sacrifice to God on an altar, it's more important to go reconcile with your brother. Make sure you're at peace with your brother, and then come back and offer things to God. Now think about that in the context of Cain and Abel. If you're familiar with the story of Cain and Abel, Abel's offering is accepted by God. Cain's offering is not accepted by God. But what was wrong in Cain's heart that God wasn't accepting his sacrifices? Maybe if Cain had followed this teaching, he wouldn't have hardened his heart even more against God and went out and murdered his brother in envy, in the spirit of envy. All right, so it goes on to say, agree quickly with your adversary while you are in the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. So basically, don't be foolish with how you hold grudges. Don't hold a grudge. Don't escalate things with harsh language. Try to be reconciled to your brother. Try to diffuse the situation. As far as your part, you should be trying to diffuse things, not escalate them. And if you get your heart in the right place and you do all this, it's a whole lot easier to prevent murders, at least for your part, right? Because if you're not harboring all this hate in your heart towards your brother, and you're not escalating things and picking a fight, well, you're less likely to ever be tempted to murder somebody. So again, regardless of whether you believe God exists or not, this teaching, if you followed it, even as a non-believer, would probably profit you in life. You'd be a happier person because you wouldn't be holding all these grudges. And B, you'd be less likely to be tempted to hurt somebody. And then end up in prison because you went the way of Cain and murdered your brother. Now, there's Christians, or people that purport to be Christians, that, evidently their faith didn't compel them to search out Christ's teachings, and it didn't compel them further to try to follow those teachings, because there are a lot of Christians that don't follow this. And the reverse could be true. There could be atheists that are very well-adjusted people that deal well with their emotions. They're in control of them. They know how to talk to people. They try to de-escalate things. You could just think of this as good conflict resolution, I suppose. But I have the added benefit, as I believe enough to come read these things for myself, and I believe enough to try to follow those things, and I also have the added benefit of fearing God. I think he'll judge me if I don't try to adhere to these teachings. And in the next verse, he does a similar thing with adultery. It's like, well, adultery starts in your heart. So learn not to lust after women you shouldn't be lusting after, and you're less likely to commit adultery. And let's say you're happily married and you want to stay that way. Well, if you follow that, you're less likely to screw up in this way and ruin your marriage. And that's true whether you're a believer or whether you're an unbeliever. But again, I have the added benefit of knowing that God knows my thoughts. God judges my heart. So I have that added incentive to try to not dwell on things that I shouldn't. You can't stop a bird from landing on your head, as I think I forgot what church father is I'm quoting, or paraphrasing, is you can't stop a bird from landing on your head. You can't control what thought pops into your head, but you can keep it from building a nest there. You can choose to not to dwell on something. If you see this thought popped into my head, maybe that's not of God. Maybe I should just push that out and think about something else. You can choose to do that. And if you do that, you're going to be much more likely to follow this commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Neither physically, neither literally, nor should you start to commit adultery in your heart. The scriptures are quite clear that God knows the thoughts of our hearts. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, it says, "The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of it, the thoughts of his heart, was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart." And there's many, many scriptures throughout the Old and New Testament that declare that God has knowledge of the thoughts of our hearts. And I was actually confessing to somebody the other day that I don't pray as much as I probably should. And I guess my rationalization of that was, well, I'm an open book to God anyway. He already knows everything I'm thinking. He knows what I need. He knows what I want. So on one hand, I should still humble myself enough to pray, but at least I have faith enough to know that he already knows everything I'm thinking anyway. And that's a pretty powerful incentive to try to chasten my own heart and make sure that I'm thinking right and dwelling on the correct things and not dwelling on evil things. And if I feel compelled to do that, well, then I'm less likely to dwell on evil things and I'm less likely to follow an evil path. So I think logically, it's a pretty strong case logically to make that if somebody truly believes this stuff and they study it, so they actually know it, believing has a huge incentive to compel behavior. So it would follow naturally that people that have that belief and are mature in their faith are much more likely to be the upstanding citizens that Jordan was talking about in his post. The question then becomes, how do we prove that? Okay, how do we prove that in a scientific context? In a world that's full of confounding variables, how do we possibly collect the data in a way that's going to be accurate? Because, you know what, well, God can judge men's hearts. You probably can't. I sort of can. I'm pretty good at reading people, especially when they're communicating with me, because they're opening up their hearts to me and I can sort of see inside. Even still, that's just a limited capacity. And if you're smart enough, I suppose you could find ways to deceive me through your communication, and then I would misread your intentions. So then, given that reality, how do we accurately collect information about who is a true Christian and who's pretending and who's maybe they're a believer and maybe it has some bearing on their life, but they're not very confident in it, so they don't report as very religious in your survey? I mean, I could imagine something like that happening. So I think A, the data is conflicting, and B, it's hard to trust anyway. So he writes back to me and he said, I decided to do some reading, and this and most of the research I found, it does seem that higher religiosity is a factor that results in a reduction of crime. So it does appear that I was likely wrong on that. Thinking about it, it does seem to make sense from an intuitive point of view. If you have some imperative to be good, you are more likely to be so. So this is what I was hinting at. Like, it seems logical that if you truly believe that God is judging your heart, and you have knowledge of the scriptures, you know, like, what his judgments are. So, like, scripture is kind of like a mirror. It shows you your faults. If you believe in God and you believe he judges you this way, it should bring you to repentance, and you should realize at some point, well, your only hope is the grace of God, because you're probably going to fall short. And that's not a license to sin. That's a license to say, hey, God, I need a lot of help with this. I need your forgiveness, and then I need you to take me by the hand and make sure that I don't screw this thing up even more. You know, if a person has that attitude and that perspective, I think it's a pretty logical case that they're probably going to be a better person than they would have been otherwise. So he goes on. I would still argue it probably is not the most important factor, like comparing crime rates in countries to the percentage of Christians or religious people does not appear to line up with in a meaningful way as far as I can see, but it would still help. So he's referencing data, but he's not citing it. So he reports this claim. He says he did some reading, and some research that he found suggests that higher religiosity, people that are more religious, it is a factor in crime reduction. And, you know, thanks for being honest and saying, look, I found some data that doesn't support my conclusion. At the very least, this is complicated, because then there's some other data that he looks at that seems to imply that there isn't a strong correlation between religion and lower crime rates or good behavior in general. Now, I can't really speak to any of this because I haven't looked at the research that he's talking about. So for all I know, this could be faulty research, or this could be faulty research, or it could be a faulty way of looking at the data. To make an analogy, I have on the screen here, this is just, I brought up Google Maps, and I'm zoomed in on New York, and I can see like the different boroughs of New York. Here's Brooklyn, here's Queens, here's Manhattan. I can see the major streets and thoroughways. That's what I can see at this resolution. Now, I can zoom out on this map, and I can zoom way out. And look, as I'm zooming out, I'm getting all kinds of new information. Like, I'm getting a lot of information that I didn't have when I was zoomed in. But it's also true that I'm losing information, because now I'm not zooming in on the details. I can no longer see the different neighborhoods. The streets it just looks like a cluster. Like, can't sort that out. So I'm gaining information by zooming out, but I'm also losing information. And you can do that same thing when you're looking at data. So yeah, zooming in might give you somewhere else, but zooming in, you might really come to understand things on a micro level, and that may or may not be applicable to the macro level. And what people tend to do is, okay, I have this perspective. I think Christianity really does have an impact on people's individual lives, and my theory is that I can extrapolate that to the more Christians, the more true, mature Christians there are in a community, the better outcomes are going to be in that community, because these true Christians are going to be better people as people of faith than they would have been absent that faith. So on a micro level, that's a pretty easy case to make logically, and you can probably find data to support that if you zoom in on an individual life or on a small community. But you can zoom out, and you can lose all that detail, and then you can start comparing, Boston with New York or Baltimore or Washington, and you can say, well, what's the religiosity level by whatever metric I'm measuring that? What's the religiosity level in Boston? And then I can take that data and I can compare it to the religiosity level of New York, and I can say, well, look, crime's higher here, or maybe vice versa. I don't really know what the crime statistics are in Boston and New York, or the comparisons are, but you know what I mean? But like, my critique of that is it's kind of fuzzy. Like, it's kind of zoomed out, and it's not well defined. Like, how are you truly measuring religiosity, and can you really judge an individual's life habits based on how they answer a phone survey, say, and like how they would describe their religiosity level. And there's a whole host of confounding variables that might be driving the crime rate here and might be different and be driving the crime rate in a different way in a different area. I would say it's pretty apparent that family structure plays a huge role in crime outcomes in a neighborhood. Like people often, just to give you a good example of zooming way out, let's zoom way out and look at, we've got the United States over here, and then we've got Western Europe over here. If you take this country as a whole and you look at our murder rate and you just say, what's the murder rate of the whole country? It's probably going to be higher than the murder rate in, say, any number of Western European countries. But what you lost in that macro view is that the crime in the U.S. is concentrated in very specific pockets. Like most of the country is perfectly peaceful, and the crime rate there is as low or lower than it is compared to any number of European countries. But the areas where there is crime, it's like really, really bad. Like there's really bad neighborhoods to live in the U.S. And that accounts for basically like puffs up our national average. And what's going on in those communities that are really, really violent? Well, it's the breakdown of the family. Some places have a 90% out of wedlock birth rate. And those areas are absolute slums. Those areas are overrun with gangs and crime and property theft, carjackings, robberies, assaults, all the violent crime is concentrated in those areas. And I would argue, in so much as being a good, mature Christian encourages you to be a better family man, better father, better mother. As a child who's brought up in the faith, you're probably much more receptive to, the good teachings of your Christian parents. So it's really the family values that make or break a community, and it's the lack of those values. It's when a critical mass of people in the neighborhood just don't have strong families. That's when you start to see the breakdown, and that turns into dysfunction and violent crime. So that would be my critique. And while it's difficult and confounding to look at data and really get to a sensible conclusion, so you almost have to have a good logical basis for believing the things that you do. So yeah, I would argue that Christianity is a deterring factor that deters people, not everybody, but deters enough people from committing violent crimes, say murder. How does it do that? Well, there's a direct prohibition on it, thou shalt do no murder. And then there's all sorts of instruction about not harboring hate in your heart, not being angry without a cause, to be rational, to not stir up trouble with harsh speech, calling your brother a fool or this or that, trying to reconcile with people that you have an issue with, turning the other cheek, not being the one to escalate things. If you apply those principles to your life, well, yes, you're going to have a much more peaceful life. And you're less likely to get into a physical altercation or to commit a murder. I think that's a perfectly logical conclusion or a perfectly logical theory to explain the data. Now the question is, how do you collect the data, and is it reliable? And are you looking at it at the right resolution level to where it's actually meaningful, where it's a meaningful comparison? And that ultimately the viewer of this is going to have to decide that for themselves, how they choose to look at the data. And I would caution that, try to account for your biases, because if you come at this with the idea that you don't think Christianity is that important and you're not a believer, well, then you're gonna look for that conclusion in the data, and the reverse is true. As a Christian, I'm going to try to justify my beliefs. My tendency is to look for the evidence that supports what I already believe, just as the atheist has their belief about God, namely that they don't think he exists, and they don't think there's any power in Christian teaching. Now, there are cultural Christians, people that are atheists, and actually a lot of prominent atheists are cultural Christians. They see the value in the teaching, they just don't accept the claims of divinity or the miracles that are contained in Scripture. But they could see the wisdom in things like, what I just described with the golden rule and things like that. But let's say you're not a cultural Christian, you're just an atheist, and you just really don't like religious people for whatever reason. Maybe you had some bad experiences. I can understand that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can understand why someone would get that way. But if that's your view, you might be tempted to cherry pick the data in a way that supports the conclusions that you want to come to, or that you've already came to and that you just want to confirm. I think I prattled on long enough. Hopefully this is interesting. And those are my opinions. Let me know yours in the comments below. Thanks for Jordan Carter for leaving some thoughtful comments. I also like that he stuck to one or 2 points. It made it easy to respond to. And hopefully I did a good job of responding to his thoughts and expounding on my own.
But I'm